Good morning to all. I am very excited here to launch our first panel discussion for the day with a very distinguished set of panelists on a topic that's very close to my heart, and we'll look at assessing how do we ensure that people are central and at the heart of the energy transition journey. So I'm going to jump right in. The idea and concept of just transition emerged, in the West, which was to really look at how do we ensure that, the coal workers are secured, are protected, and how do we really align the social justice with the aspect of climate justice. But today, just transition has gone way beyond that. The idea, the concept is more all-encompassing, and it looks at when we're greening an economy, how do we ensure that there's no one left behind. It's how do we ensure that we really, everybody really goes and moves beyond. And I think I'm going to first turn to you, Mr. Kumar. You have a very unique perspective, having served the former, being the former chairman and managing director of ONGC, and now that you're more involved in the solar sector. But I think more importantly, you've been a very active member of the Energy Transition Advisory Board, which was set up by the Government of India. And they have made some very seminal and critical recommendations, for example, on electric buses, on metro rails. Could you perhaps elaborate on what those recommendations are and what the significance of those recommendations are to India's energy transition journey? And also, more importantly, how do these recommendations ensure the centrality of people?
Thank you, Manat, and good morning to all of you. It's like braving midst of the kind of pollution. I think the context for this particular discussion is set. So when we started our work at Energy Transition Advisory Committee, we tried to identify the key contextual points based on which we should be moving. One is that India, and probably that's true of Global South, requires substantial amount of energy to grow over the next 20-25 years. By 2050, depending on whose estimates you quote, India would require something between 2.5 times to 3 times the energy in quantitative terms, and to keep on growing. Now, the challenge is that you need to secure that energy, use that energy in a manner that you also simultaneously reduce the carbon footprint. Also, what was relevant to note for us was that while Indian energy emissions were increasing, cumulative emissions are at all-time only at around 4%. That actually comes probably subsequently, I'll come to that, is relates to the funding of the transition, who and how the transition should be funded. But broadly, taking responsibility about what we need to do within India, we thought that let's first look at our own endowments, natural endowments. So from that perspective, we realized that biofuel is an area very lot more can happen. India has done tremendously well as far as harnessing solar energy is concerned, though I recognize that we have miles to go, yet probably a template has been created based on which success can be further improved upon. But as far as biofuel is concerned, we have done tremendously well as far as ethanol is concerned, but CBG should be a next area where we can make a huge difference. And domestically secured CBG is not only a solution to the energy, but I think people being at the focus, we are putting income in the hands of our villages, and the bottom-up push effect of that particular income generation in rural sector is significantly higher. So from that perspective, it is very important. Another key principle we thought is relevant is that at the end of the day, conversions of energy, multiple conversions of energy are possible, but I think at the end of the day, energy as molecule or electron should be used at the earliest possible opportunity wherever it is found to be the most appropriate. Because at the end of the day, there is a huge inefficiency and cost involved in conversion, and long distance supply chains are not at all desirable if there is a if there is a local market available. In this regard, we also thought of, let's say, how the things like hydrogen, the new solutions, countries like India, and that's also true of global South, we have a infrastructure relating to energy, existing infrastructure, but our energy needs are so large that there is no need to retire the existing infrastructure. We can actually create mechanism to lower their carbon footprint, but superimpose the cleaner sources of energy, and in that respect, hydrogen can play a big role. It is actually different from some of the advanced countries where they will have to retire their investments. So luckily, that's something which is positive for the countries who are trying to secure, who require more and more energy and are looking for greener sources. At the end of it, I also feel, I think during the initial phase, let me also say that everything has to be people-centric. And from that perspective, I also say that, for example, if we were to talk in terms of mobility, we are talking in terms of, let's say, one versus other option, let's say EVs versus hybrids. We also have to see what impact on the people does a transition to a particular path make. Because if there is an existing ecosystem, if tens of lakhs of people or hundreds of millions of people are employed in that supply chain, how do we retrain? How do we find jobs for them before switching? That should also be a consideration. And overall, probably we should avoid technology tie-ins. We should not vote in favor or against a technology. Anything which helps reduce the carbon footprint should be promoted. In fact, the carbon footprint should be the only basis of taking a decision on in which direction we should be going. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar, for laying out, the importance of resilient supply chains, and also the importance of alternative fuels like biofuels and hydrogen, for example. We've had a very interesting session on the Global Biofuels Alliance on the inaugural day, and we'll talk more about hydrogen today sometime in the evening. I'm going to now swiftly move on to you, Joseph. Joseph is also our co-host for the dialogue, and he's also the CEO of the Africa Climate Summit. So I'd love to know more about the outcomes from that summit and what the learnings were. But I think my two specific questions to you will be, what are the challenges and opportunities for just and equitable transitions in Africa? And a quick follow-up to that would be, in what ways are those opportunities and challenges similar and different from other emerging economies and regions and countries like India? So over to you.
Thank you, Manat, and good morning, everyone. So on the challenges and opportunities on the continent, I think the most visible energy transition conversation is South Africa, and I'll leave that to Sue to speak to. But we also have similar conversations in countries like Nigeria and so on. And I think the challenges, or perhaps I start with the opportunities, and as the previous speaker mentioned, in countries where you don't have fully established infrastructure, it's an opportunity to build the right low carbon energy from the ground up. The opportunities, therefore, are you have a blank slate or a relatively unpainted canvas to which you can define what a good outcome in terms of energy transition looks like on the continent. I think in terms of energy consumption at the moment, a majority of it is really biomass in most of the smaller African countries. And so if we were going to talk about transition, we would talk about transition in the context of the existing consumption. So things like clean cooking, things like clean transportation, and so on. The challenges are enormous. The first one, I think, is access to capital. Africa tends to pay, or the Global South tends to pay a substantial premium on the cost of financing for infrastructure. And we all know that if you're paying a premium on infrastructure costs, it means that the unit produced will be relatively expensive compared to where you have lower costs of financing. And there I'm sure Pradeep will speak to what MDBs are doing around reducing the cost of finance. The second, I think, is the nature of projects on the continent. Outside of the large economies like South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, projects are relatively small. You're talking 10, 20 megawatt projects. Financing those is really expensive because you don't have the economies of scale. I've seen in India, for example, you have solar power bids at 2 or 3 cents, but that's because it's hundreds of megawatts. In smaller grids, if you're to install solar in the hundreds of megawatts, you're going to compromise that grid. And my colleague, the PS from Malawi, I'm sure he's in the room, can speak to some of the challenges they're facing with 60 megawatts of solar on the grid. So the second one I would say is the nature of our grids, the size of our grids requires smaller installed generation. That comes with significant economies of scale costs. And the third challenge I would say is technology. So everything we install is largely imported, and that has substantial costs. It doesn't add significant manufacturing value to the continent and so on. So I think that would be the third challenge I would point out. And then how does that compare with other countries in the Global South from an energy transition perspective? I think, again, the same challenges I mentioned. If you're able to get larger scale solar projects in India, for example, in Bangladesh, in those bigger countries, then you're able to get the right economies of scale in terms of cost. And that would be one of the biggest differences. I think the other is technology. India has solar panel manufacturers, equipment manufacturers. In fact, everything including small hydro technology exists in the country. And so you're not facing the same challenges that countries that cannot make this equipment is facing, not only from an availability perspective, a logistics perspective, but also from a cost of imports perspective. And when you import equipment, you're paying in dollars, but the revenues are coming in local currency, and the local currency cost is also substantial. So I'd say that's the other difference I would identify. In the interest of time, let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for talking more about biomass and clean cooking fuels and cleaner transportation, all very important when we're thinking of people in the energy transition and just transition debate. Particularly thank you for highlighting the importance of collaboration so that economies of scale can begin. I think that's very important, something that we can look at to do more collectively in the Global South. And also very importantly for touching upon the topic of costing of finance and also the conditionalities that are often attached with this finance, right? So far the risk rating matrices that currently exist burden emerging economies with a premium on capital, which the West doesn't seem to have to pay for. So I think I'd leave Suranjali and Pradeep to handle that question. But I think you've already given me the cue to move on to Sue in your initial response. So Sue, naturally, I think you're from South Africa, and it's inevitable I will come to you on the question of JETPs. So my question to you would be, what is the current state of play of JETPs in South Africa? There is a lot of controversy around it. There is a lot of hope around it at the same time. What would you say what more can South Africa do to raise capital and finance to support its energy transition efforts? And secondly, what should other countries learn from South Africa's experience when they're considering JETPs for their own countries, in their own context?
Thanks very much, Manat. And firstly, thank you for inviting South Africa to have a voice at this important forum. It's been a pleasure to be here and to listen to the experiences in India and elsewhere that have been on the platform in the last few days. So thank you. South Africa is a poor country. We have very high rates of unemployment and very high rates of inequality. 80% of our electricity is generated from coal. and the coal is concentrated in largely one of our provinces. So people's livelihoods in that area are integrally tied up in the coal value chain. So when we talk about a just transition in South Africa, there's been a very strong emphasis from government and civil society, trade unions and business, that the transition has to be just and that it has to make improvements to the lives of ordinary people, and they have to feel that improvement from the start. So we are not going to win this energy transition unless people feel that their lives are improving and that the quality of existence gets better. So it's been an absolute focus. We've had a Presidential Climate Commission that was established by the President to independently advise him on the climate change transition investments that are needed and on both mitigation and adaptation. And the PCC established a just transition framework, which went through our cabinet and was approved even before the process of raising the capital was happening. So we have established the notion of a just transition in South Africa really from the beginning. And the framework has three important components. The one is procedural justice. The second is distributive justice, and the third is restorative justice. And these are principles that then inform the way in which our just energy transition planning has taken place. And so everyone was involved in establishing those principles. There was a lot of consultation, and the document is now a publicly approved and formal basis for all of our work. So I am in the project management unit in the presidency, which is responsible for designing the implementation plan for the JETP. And we've been doing that since over the last year. Since the pledge was made by the developed countries to support South Africa's just transition, and that happened in Glasgow at COP26, so at the end of 2021. So in 2022, we developed the investment plan, where we set out the scale of need for South Africa's just energy transition. And that was a scale of need far beyond what the international community had pledged to South Africa for support. So our scale of need came in at about $98 billion over a 5-year period. And the offer on the table from the international community was $8.5 billion. So you can see a very big difference between what was pledged and what we had calculated would be needed to make the transition. So what we then set about doing is really trying to unpack what that $8.5 billion meant for South Africa. 500 million of that, or just over 500 million, was in the form of grants. So a relatively small portion of the 8.5. And the rest was made up almost 50-50 between loans to the sovereign in one form or the other, and commercial debt, equity, and guarantees. So what we've been doing over the last year is to work out how we actually implement the plan that we set out by the end of last year. And we have just completed an implementation plan, which is going through cabinet approval processes as we speak. So we're hoping to be able to launch that next month and be able to advise our colleagues both locally and internationally on how we're going to roll out this implementation process. So one of the things we've done is to focus very closely on what is happening to the grant money that has been allocated to South Africa, because this is perhaps the most valuable money that we need in order to address the just transition issues, which really mostly can't be addressed through debt and equity and guarantees. So a lot of it is community level work, a lot of it is developing new economic opportunities for people on the ground, and also building communities' ability to take charge of their futures, to be social actors and deciders in the way in which their futures will unfold. So we've set up a JET IP grants register, which we will make public very soon, as showing exactly where those grants are being spent. Many of them, so about 50% of those grants that have been pledged are in projects at the moment, and others, about another 40% are in the planning phase. So not all of it is deployed. And what we're identifying is that a lot of the grants are being spent on technical assistance and capacity building, training, that sort of thing. Not much is actually reaching community level entrepreneurship. Not much is being used creatively to leverage other sources of finance or provide first loss positions on new businesses. So we're going to be very proactively trying to maximize and optimize the use of grants so that we're getting better value for money and better results on the ground. So it's one of the focus areas for the year ahead. One of the other things that we have had to face is that our project preparation skills and abilities are not where they need to be. So there's no shortage of capital in the broadest sense, but the ability to produce good project preparation plans and have those ready for financing is something that needs attention. So one of the things we're setting up at the moment is what we're calling a funding platform, which is really going to be a matchmaking facility between the providers in the first instance, the providers of grant capital and project originators, so that we can begin to match the sources of grant funding that are available with viable and good projects that are going to achieve the outcomes that we intend. So these are some of the initiatives that we've got underway at the moment. We have a real constraint in terms of accessing the loans that have been made available to South Africa. They are really coming from the international DFIs and the MDBs, and they are targeted at the sovereign or at state-owned companies with sovereign guarantees. And our sovereign is under fiscal constraint and really struggling to agree to any additional borrowing under the debt constraints that it's living with at the moment. So it's very difficult to move that capital. And the state-owned company that is the owner of our electricity infrastructure and the generator of electricity is also under severe debt constraints and is not able to borrow at the moment. So we are sitting, and you'll see we're sitting with a lot of concessional debt that has been offered to South Africa that is not actually being deployed right now. We have to find a way to get it into the system. We've got a lot of private capital that's coming on stream, and really as a result of the great regulatory reforms that we brought in recent years, we've now got a lot of private capital moving into renewable energy, which is really encouraging and is starting to pick up pace tremendously. So that's largely where we are at the moment. I know I've run out of time, so we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And I think there's so much that we can hear from you and learn from you on this. So we probably, a lot of us in the room would want to pick your brain on that later. But I think in the interest of time, I'm going to swiftly move on to you, Suranjali. You've always been our finance expert in the room. And I'd really like to know from you, in your opinion, what is the role of innovative finance and strategies and mechanisms to ensure that people on the ground reap the benefits of energy transitions, and they create a scenario where we have, hopefully only winners and no losers in the process. And just a very quick follow-up to that would be, to what extent do you think, so far just transition is a very state-led, public finance-led debate discourse, right? How do we ensure that the private sector also gets included and is also part of providing solutions for equitable transition?
So let me begin here to say that what we're doing with Just Transition is to question how markets work. We're trying to say that companies think of assets as capex, and they think about what is the value loss if you have to get rid of them. They think of their time horizons, but when it comes to labor, there's a very different approach there, which is these are contracts that are written and we don't think about them beyond their life cycle, which is when you decide to let them go. And with a high level of contractualization of labor, I think it becomes, this problem becomes even more severe because there is no need to account for the job losses. And I think it's important to start at that end when we talk about just transitions. There are a lot of moving parts to this. Just transition doesn't mean just intra-regional or inter-regional. It's also inter-nation. So it has to be addressed at different levels. But I think the easier part, easy in the sense that you can quantify and start thinking about how you want to address it, would be where you're looking at who are these people who are going to be affected if we have a transition plan for a company. And I think there is some early thinking. There's some early thinking at regional level. Some companies are also conscious of what is their profile of employees. And I think there needs to be a matrix of emissions saved versus jobs that will be lost, to just demonstrate that when you're asking ambition, what are the changes that you're going to see. Now, it's not as if we don't have frameworks today of thinking about just transition. It's not a new concept. We've spoken about rehabilitation of people. It's in the law. We have several laws in place. There's also something called severance package. We also have unemployment allowances, which exist across the world. I think what needs to be done is to quantify what is the sustainable level of support that can be given during the period of transition. Now, just taking an example of unemployment allowance. If you imagine some people will be unemployed for a certain period, you have to estimate what those number of years would be to integrate them back into employment or the labor force, and what should be the state level support. So that means you have to do something on your public finances. The IMF and the World Bank think that raising taxes is easy. I think it's not. I think it requires recalibration and rethinking on public finance management, which again is a separate discussion. But I think perhaps that can be used to support in some ways communities. So let's say communities would be supported more strongly through the public finance angle, because these are indirect effects of when a company begins to withdraw its operations in a region. Also, it allows governments to think about the strategies on economic diversification. And so then you could have fiscal giveaways to the least extent, but giveaways to create or regenerate activity, and then also think about severance packages or temporary support by companies where they know that it's absolutely necessary for some of the workers to be let go, which I imagine would be the case for some of the companies. So I think in terms of instruments, we keep talking about CSR. That money goes into health and education today. Perhaps we'll continue to see an uptick there. The challenge of using CSR money, again, for supporting of reskilling, which is also central to the conversation on just transition, is that CSR laws can prohibit you to do something that is aligned to your business activity. And so therefore, you have to think of more sources of revenue within the company, which could be allowances that are set aside, keeping in mind that there will be questions asked if you do not reintegrate these people into the company or you let them go as of the next few years. I think those are my few sort of takeaways on how you define and how you attack the problem of just transition.
Thank you. I think very well attacked. Yeah, and I particularly liked your point around quantifying a lot of these arguments and approaches. And I think that helps us also, it really underscores the importance of data in this conversation as well. I think I'm going to now quickly move on to you, Pradeep. So you with the ADB, and ADB has done some incredible work. We had a very interesting session during the inaugural as well, and we spoke about, in fact, yesterday with Mr. N.K. Singh, and there was a report that came out on the role of MDBs and the transformational change that they can bring about in the energy transition and the climate finance landscape. ADB is a very active, is playing a very active role in Asia in supporting these energy transition efforts. In your opinion, what is the role of MDBs in the just transition process, not just the energy transition process? And what are those practical and relevant and swift solutions that you believe we can roll out in the short term? And secondly, as a follow-up, MDBs are considered to be the catalyst to, rope in more private capital, to mobilize more private capital. So in addition to that, I'll add, how do we also rope in and interact more with sub-regional governments and sub-national governments to be able to reach communities on the ground and create more deeper impact? So over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. So we heard a couple of interesting phrases this morning. Weaponizing of finance, I think, was mentioned earlier, and attacking just transition. So maybe we should just take a more calmer and perhaps a more kinder approach. I think just transition, as Sue mentioned, really is centered on two major elements, right? You've got justice and equity, and the fact that you want to keep people at the center of all of this. And we really need to, as you mentioned, Mana, this really originates in the 80s, and it's enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And so the MDBs have a clear mandate to work on just transition. We're required to do so. As mentioned earlier in the morning, when we talk about energy transition, you're really talking about phasing in renewables. And you have to phase out fossil fuel. This may not happen tomorrow or the next year or the next decade. It's an interdecadal process, but it's never too early to start thinking about people. Now, most MDBs have very good experience building stuff. We've been doing this for 50 to 80 years, right? We know how to finance, we know how to set up infrastructure, and we've done a very good job, I think, of taking care of the environment and the social aspects around these building of stuff. But we don't have a lot of experience tearing down things, retiring, decommissioning, and transforming. So the MDBs got together just before the COP at Glasgow, COP26, and we agreed on a joint high-level principles for just transition. And it, essentially rests on the pillars that Sue mentioned, the three forms of, justice. And there are really three pillars, three key elements to this. There are infrastructure. We're talking about mines. We're talking about hard infrastructure, networks, pipelines. Eventually, when we talk about moving beyond, say, oil and gas at some point. We're also talking about communities, people. And the third element is governance, right? How people are consulted, how they are involved in the process. So particularly for ADB, the way we approach this is, how do we translate all these high-level concepts into planning, a framework? And think of an onion, right? Multiple layers of an onion. So you start at the asset level. It's really down to the first step is, what plant are we talking about? What coal mine are we talking about? What particular asset are we talking about? And then we look at sort of the community around it. And you have direct impacts, indirect impacts, and you have induced impacts. And I think induced is particularly interesting. I think several speakers spoke to it. A couple of interesting statistics, right? The Indian Railways gets 40% of its revenue moving coal across the country. So over the next few decades, as we phase out of coal, that revenue has to be substituted, or you're going to see a concomitant increase in passenger tariffs, right? And take the case of Germany, where initially you had local cooperatives actually managing the land being used for solar generation. Soon you had large companies coming in, and you had them being pushed out of the process, and now we've got corporatization of the solar park, right? So one really needs to think about all these long-term sort of processes. So think about the asset, think about the region, then the sub-regional, the national, and the international. And you really need to understand the impacts and plan for responses at each of those levels. So it's very early. We've just started to do some pilot assessments. So ADB is a key partner of the JETP process in Indonesia. Indonesia exports a lot of coal, so they're a domestic consumer, but they're also a massive exporter. And in the case of India, as you all know, there are probably more than 50 districts that are heavily reliant on coal mining. And then if you look at other minerals as well, that's probably half the country. And anywhere between 2 to 5 million people are indirectly and directly affected. And if you look at the induced, you're looking at over tens of millions of people. So we've started to work with the state of Jharkhand, which is actually the first state in the country to have a just energy transition task force. to look at a couple of districts, in Dhanbad in this case, to see how we can actually understand the dependency of communities on coal, and then look at how can we begin to put in place reskilling, upskilling, economic diversification, and economic transformational plans, so that as and when these communities need to respond, they will be well placed. Now, I know we're running out of time, just a couple of things. Financing is obviously very important. MDBs are well placed because we combine concessional financing with our quasi-commercial financing, and to do that. A couple of things especially was mentioned is domestic resource mobilization. Let's not forget that. There will never be enough international financing to meet all the needs. CSR was mentioned, really important piece. The other is the district mineral funds, the DMFs. So the country has a system of levying a charge on mineral extraction. Now, if you look at studies that have been done by groups in India, a lot of that money is going towards, small infrastructure development, so on, health. Not enough is going into skilling and reskilling. And that is a long-term process. We've got to start now. So definitely maximize on accessing global finance, global climate finance, but then also look at domestic sources by which countries can then own the climate agenda, as was also mentioned earlier today. Let me stop here, Manath.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think, I agree with you. I think ensuring that your domestic, like your DRM, domestic resource mobilization, is as important as sort of relying on international capital. So I think thank you for bringing that point around. How do we ensure that our internal infrastructure is strong enough to attract that capital in the first place? I think we have just a couple of more minutes left, so I'm going to quickly go on to the gentleman who will be making our first intervention.
Thank you, Manath, for giving this opportunity. I want to raise some issue related with my country. Countries like Nepal is heavily affected from climate change. This happens not because of Nepal. But Nepal is also go for inclusive energy transition. Still, many people living in remote area are deprived of sufficient clean energy. In my opinion, we have to build a mechanism at international level to support inclusive energy transition in countries like Nepal. My question goes to Mr. Pradeep. Does ADB have any specific strategy for funding electricity access to truly marginalized group in developing countries? Thank you.
I'm sorry, if I could just repeat, the question was, does ADB have programs for supporting electrification in client countries?
That's right.
Yes. Energy access is a huge part of what we do. It's a massive priority. We have all sorts of programs, both in the public and private sector. We can finance projects through the governments.
My question is for marginalized group. Those people who are very poor, who lives in very remote area, due to the expenditure, it is very expensive. Green energy value is very expensive, so that poor people, marginalized people cannot use it. So what is the program from IDP international community to support this group?
Thank you. I think it's on energy access.
No, we like, as I mentioned, in cases where there are large government programs, we can finance those. For instance, we're looking to finance programs under the KUSUM, which is the Government of India's program, but we have similar programs in other countries. We also support mini grids, which are truly in the off-grid areas, both mini grids that are solar and also looking at hybrid with some element of battery storage. We're talking to, for instance, the state of Jharkhand to see if we can look at their solar program, including solar villages. So, and we also work with the private sector. We have supported mini grid companies in the past, which have, business models where they charge a certain tariff. And where there are viability gap needs, we can also come in with grant financing. So we work with partners such as GEAP and others to access concessional financing, 0% loans or even grants that we can blend in with our own resources and provide it into such programs. So we have numbers on our website. We've connected, over 100 million people in the last decade or so.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the audience?
Pradeep ji mentioned a very important factor for just energy transition, that is skilling and reskilling. especially a conversation I often have with my good friend, the Danish ambassador, is the importance of creating a new generation of individuals who are skilled and will enable energy transitions. So, and Joseph, how do you see that happening in the Africa region, especially the role of educational institutions? I believe the University of Johannesburg has a program in skilling individuals to enable this. How do you see that happening? Thank you.
I think, how do we invest in human capital to support and advance energy? So, who do you want to start?
All right. Joseph will come after me. Thank you. It's a very important question. When we designed the JETP, it initially focused on big infrastructure, so electricity infrastructure, electric vehicles, green hydrogen. And then we said, look, skills is a cross-cutting area that needs very specific investment. And the other cross-cutting area was municipal infrastructure and municipal capacity to actually do work on the ground. So in terms of the implementation plan for skills, it's actually, as you know, a very complex thing because you've got so many institutions involved in educational activities. But what we've designed for the just transition is to develop skills development zones, which are geographically focused, using the institutions in those geographic areas and focusing on the critical economic diversification that is targeted to happen in that geography. So in the Mpumalanga area where it's very coal dependent, we're looking at future industries around renewable energy and around battery industry development. So we are going to be designing education and skills training, vocational training programs around those specific industries in that specific region and with the institutions that service that region. Then on green hydrogen, we've got another part of the country that is going to be carrying most of the infrastructure investment for green hydrogen, and we're going to focus in that zone on the green hydrogen skills. And then in another region of the country, we are focusing on electric vehicles and the manufacturing capacity that is needed to transition from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles. And then we will work with those institutions to develop the curricula and the targeted programs at specific people and groups of people within those regions. That's the plan. And then now we've got to actually implement it. One of the things that we identified in the implementation planning process is that there is a lot of funding in the private sector that already is earmarked for skills and in fact is statutorily required to be earmarked for skills. So a lot of this is going to be working with the private sector to target those kind of reskilling programs in those regions for those transitions. And the other thing that we've also picked up is that there's actually quite a lot of capital in the public sector that could be redeployed better for this transitional reskilling. So yeah, there's been a lot of thought and effort gone into how we're going to do this. We've just now got to do it. So that's the big new challenge. And I'll come back in a couple of years and let you know how it's going. All right.
We've actually already gone over time, but I will let you conclude with your comment and response, Joseph.
Thank you. I wanted Sue to go first, and I was hoping she would mention that we're supporting the fast reskilling of workers at Komati Power Plant, which is a fast decommissioned coal plant. As GIAP, we see skills development and the human capital as a huge component of the energy transition conversation. And so starting with this particular facility that's training hundreds of former coal workers to be ready to install solar and wind, which will be placed in the same site in South Africa. We are hoping that through this grant funding, we can also demonstrate how this could work. For the rest of the continent, it remains a big challenge, which is unless it's private companies who are doing the investments and through the process then also invest in training people, proper programs don't exist yet. Yes, there's taxes and private sector requirement to contribute a certain amount towards training, but that implementation still needs to happen, as Sue has said. So there's quite a bit of work to be done towards that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us for this session. Thank you all for listening.